And I must say this, I've checked his qualifications. You are indeed a qualified psychoanalyst.
To be able to reach deep into the depths, Gordon Soley, of the subconscious of my opponents is truly a rare talent. One, of course, that only Dr. Red Roberts possesses.
Hey guys, it's your boy Wolf here. Gonna keep this short and sweet because I really want us to get into this interview. I'm very excited about what we're gonna talk about over the next two episodes. I just really am excited for this. Dr. Red Roberts, wrestler of the late 70s and 80s, also a forensic psychologist. We're gonna sit and talk a little bit about pro wrestling psychology, the future, the past, and the present. So with that, I'm just gonna keep this short and say enjoy. All right, everyone. I'm promised this for a couple weeks now, and so I'm very happy to be with Dr. Red Roberts, also known as Dr. Michael Brannon. I will use Dr. Red Roberts. So how are you today, sir?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to do this. It's a nice little variance from what I usually do day to day, but reminds me of some very good times I had a couple of decades ago.
Absolutely. So let's talk about what you do right now. You are a forensic psychologist in the state of Florida.
I am. I do work with individuals mostly who have been arrested, have had bad things happen that either to them or to somebody else that they've caused. So I see a lot of murder cases. I see a lot of, sexual assault cases, bank robberies, bad things that you can think about happening in the world. I see a lot of that. Where I was a heel in the back in the many years ago, now I see a lot of people who truly are heels in real life.
Right. And which is great because I did a little bit of research, not a lot, but I was reading that you were a resident rehab counselor for teen youths and you saw how much they loved pro wrestling and that helped you kind of get in yourself.
Yes, it was really an amazing thing. I didn't expect that, but I was for 10 years, I ran a substance abuse program for teenagers, and they were somehow all caught up in the wrestling business. So we did a number of shows for them. Matter of fact, we did the first rock and wrestle show. We had that first concept. We did a rock and roll show and a wrestling show all together to raise funds for the children who were there at that facility. So it was a great way of kind of giving them moral lessons about, good and bad and evil and good having to persevere and triumphing in the end. And so it was great little morality stories we could tell them and they actually come and talk about it and get some of the wrestlers to come into group and talk about what they were trying to convey and the messages they were trying to get across. So it was really a lot of fun. And I think it served a purpose in delineating between good and evil for them and how good, if persevering, comes out in the end.
That's fantastic. That's I love hearing about like how origin stories and how everyone kind of got their start in the business. Did you start in Florida? Because I believe you also worked for Savoldi, which was up in the Northeast.
I did. You've done your research on me. So I did. I worked through the Caribbean. I worked, throughout Florida. I was originally started by the great Malenko, Boris Malenko. So he trained me and I really started in Florida as a result of him. But yeah, then I traveled quite a bit after that. Had a couple tours of Japan and also wrestled for Mario Savoldi up in the New Jersey area. So yeah, I had quite a nice run there for just over 10 years.
And did you like just because psychology was always your thing, was there ever an end game in wrestling or just you just wanted to do it for that purpose?
Well, I had to make a decision. So as I was wrestling and getting phone calls about going other places and going to other territories back in the territory days, as I was getting those phone calls to come to different territories, I had to make a decision. I was getting close to running out of time for completing my doctoral degree in psychology. And if I didn't complete it, then that door would have been shut on me. So I had to make a call on what was best. My love that I'd had since I was 6 years old of professional wrestling and staying with that and seeing what I could do out there on the open market and see if I could draw a big contract with NWA or back then or with WWE back at WWF back then, or whether to come back and do my career. So I made the decision to come back and be a psychologist, but some still say that I might have done some other things if I took a different direction. So it's always interesting to know what you did and what you didn't do.
Yeah, personally, just seeing clips of you from 87, 88, I think there was a lot of legs for you to really push nationally and internationally as well.
That's very nice. It was a lot of fun. I really did enjoy my time there and the people who I met. So I certainly would not have been unhappy doing that. I just spent a lot of time and investment in doing a doctoral career, but it still was a love of mine and continues to be a love of mine.
Absolutely. We talked off air about your doctorate dissertation. You want to let people know exactly what that entailed?
Sure, it's funny. I've actually been cross-examined about this on witness stands where they're trying to make fun of me on a witness stand, and I always turn it around on them. I have the only published study on professional wrestling. It was called The Personality Variables of Successful and Unsuccessful Professional Wrestlers. The real story is that nobody in the academia was really interested in wrestling, but there was a particular test called the 16PF, the 16 personality factors, which is still around, a psychological test, empirically driven psychological test. And they had used a number of different populations, including, of course, college students, to develop standardization groups for this test. So they wanted a new group. And sure enough, I had a new group that I was familiar with and traveling with called professional wrestlers. And my dissertation committee could not have been more excited to have this brand new group to be able to try out the 16PF. So there I got to travel around and hand out in dressing rooms, items off the 16PF to numerous wrestlers all over the state of Florida and have them fill it out and get some results that I think were very interesting.
Fantastic. And I was telling you how I also wanted to do it because I went for my master's in American history and I wanted to do my dissertation on the history of professional wrestling. I was going to interview actually Angelo Savoldi because he was still alive at the time.
Wow.
That's how far back I wanted to go back to talk about, people on the road then and kind of, splice it into how people were on the road now and talk about how the history and changes that have occurred. And, that's something we're going to talk about too, as it especially relates to psychology of pro wrestling. But
Yes.
unfortunately, I was turned down. I
It
was
was
told nobody would be able to read it.
It's very interesting, though. I mean, for those who are wrestling devotees, that kind of thing is, very, very interesting to hear about because so many people have so many different perceptions of what life was like. And of course, when I was wrestling, back in the 80s, late 70s and through the 80s, I mean, the psychology was really different. I mean, how you went about, making sure you had work and making sure that you stayed within an office. We had a name for it. We called it the office hold. And the way that you got the office hold was really different back then because you needed different office holds or ways of staying and working there for as long as you can and being as important as you could in that area before you moved on. Now the office hold is different. So the psychology and the way that wrestlers think about their positions and their narratives and stories that they're telling are very different.
Yeah, and I think the big thing you mentioned is territories. I think that's also plays a role because now independent wrestling, a lot of promotions run once a month, once every other month. You can't really develop a story. You're just throwing matches together and hoping that the two wrestlers that go out have a good match.
Correct. Your story is told in the ring. So, and it's really not a long-term story like the ones that are told now that people are drawn to, where you actually have television to do it, and time and energy, and the internet to do it, social media to
Yep.
do it. So you have different ways of your story being told now that we would have never dreamed of before. So many of the stories were told just in the ring, just a classic battle of a good guy versus a bad guy. Heel versus baby face. And so in doing that, we were just trying to capture that moment. Now they're capturing days, weeks, and months with stories, years
Correct.
actually, and building
Absolutely.
mania matches.
Yeah, and the one thing that a lot of people talk about is how there is no psychology in wrestling right now. And I waffle on it every day because I think it depends on the wrestler now. And I think it depends on your audience. And I think that's always been true because what worked in New Jersey probably didn't work in Florida and vice versa. You had to rely on who your audience is. And that's really the essence to me of what wrestling psychology is you're able to read your audience out there. You know what they're expecting or maybe what they're not expecting. And then you cater your character or your gimmick or what you say based on what they're expecting and not expecting.
Yes, the problem is it's much more complicated now. I mean, we can give a political example of this without being political.
Yeah,
A political example would be like for about half the country, Donald Trump is a heel, and about half the country, he's a babyface.
yep,
But he's using the same gimmick, if you'll use that term lightly, but he's using the same gimmick. He's saying the same things that some people are perceiving as heel and other are perceiving as babyface. Now, I know that's a pretty dramatic example, but I do think you can compare that to professional wrestling. John Cena now, and through historically, some people yelled, let's go Cena, Cena sucks. The same
Yep.
people sometimes saying that. And now look, as he's made a heel turn, look at what's happening with that psychology. They definitely wanted him to be a heel, but many people are cheering him wildly when he's in the ring and refuse to buy the heel turn. Well, how come? It's because things are much more complicated. We know more about the wrestlers now. Kayfabe is dead. So as a result of that, you just know more about the wrestlers. John Cena is a really good guy.
Yep.
And so because you know that, and you spend so much time with charities and doing those kinds of things, it's hard for wrestling to position your character different from what people know because there's such a thirst for knowledge about these wrestlers who are performing.
Yep. And I also feel psychology has changed even recently as this year because with, Triple H and TKO, they basically expose the business themselves and they've set it up to be more of a stage play versus, life term. Like they've established the Cody Rhodes inside the ring, the John Cena inside the ring aren't the same. And so they've kind of changed it to where now people are going in watching it just like they would, a play at the theater.
Yes, and when I was trained by people and was around people who kayfabe was very important to, the great Malenko who trained me and the people who surrounded him, were it was very important to them to make sure that nobody knew the secret. And the psychology behind that was that if anyone knew it wasn't real what we were doing, they wouldn't show up. They wouldn't come. So if kayfabe died, the wrestling business would die. So no one exposed it. You didn't expose it to your wife or your girlfriend or your mother or your father or whoever it might be, because that would kill the business for you and for everybody else. But then they realized that people still show up because much like seeing a movie or much like seeing a TV show, they can suspend reality when they get there. And if the act is good enough and the character development and the story is good enough, people suspend that judgment. They don't think about getting hit in the face 5 times with someone's fist isn't going to knock them out or even bloody them up. They can just keep coming back for more and more, get dropped from the top turnbuckle onto the floor, that would kill most people. But wrestlers pop back up and people will suspend that reality. But if the people who I dealt with back then, Bob Roop and the great Malenko and Carl Gotch and people like that, if they would have ever known that people are openly talking about it like this now Bob Roop does that now, but I think he's still in a little shell shock, realizing that people are that openly exposing the business. I just want to tell you one other thing about that. Back then, I think the wrestlers very much saw themselves as a subculture. They saw themselves very much as kind of an in-group. It was an in-group versus an out-group. They were the in-group, and they had this little secret, much like a group of magicians. They had the secrets to how things were done, and they were keeping that to themselves and only special people that they let in. We only had a special language, too. We spoke Carney to each other. Many of the guys did. The old school guys taught you that. So as to keep the marks from knowing about kayfabe. So that subculture disappeared when the internet and social media took over and people learned about it. It took over. So the psychology became different in how you developed your characters and how you told your stories.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that because I also went through kind of that initiation phase because I broke in 2002. I was only 17 at the time. So I didn't do any real training, but they really had me sit backstage, just listen, learn from there. But doing all that, and then when I started bumping and I started training, they put me to be a referee because they want me to hear how to call matches inside. So I had initiation where they had a bunkhouse battle royal with all the roster, and nobody told me that I was going to end up being involved in it as well. So my initiation was basically all the guys, in order, basically lined up and just were taking shots at me. They were safe shots. They weren't like shoot, but they were all laying into me. They would tell me in my ear, what to do. And then at the end, they basically, the one guy had a gimmick of like a frat boy and he had one of those frat paddles. And so they basically like took turns just hitting me a couple times on the butt with it. And so that was my initiation. I survived that. I worked the next day and they were all talking about it backstage. Like he proved himself.
Wow. Well, I must tell you, back in the day, whether it be the Florida, championship wrestling or some of the other schools that were going on, I must tell you the initiations were much tougher than that. So, guys were getting banged up pretty bad and guys were being discouraged very strongly from going into the business by other people who really knew their way around the ring and were genuine shooters, scary shooters that came across. So, and that's how well protected the business was. Because again, it was about the business. They felt like they were protecting their money and protecting other people's money in their territories. So now that it's become this, I mean, it really is very, very different the way people perceive the wrestling business. And there's huge stars now making huge amounts of money with people knowing all about what goes on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. You mentioned the word marks, and it's funny because my wife asked me the other day, she was like, I hear the term marks. She's probably a bigger fan of the current wrestling than I am, but I do enjoy some bits and pieces of it. But what's your definition of mark, or especially back then, what was the definition of a mark?
Well, it's changed. Like, for instance, I'm a mark. I love the sport and I suspend reality. And I believe I cry sometimes when I see something happen, like somebody leaving. I get tears. I'm ashamed of it, but I get tears in my eyes when I see someone retiring because of an injury or something. And that's because I'm a mark. I'm a fan. I'm still part of it. But I was not a mark before. So a mark before, in the classical sense of it, was someone who just didn't know and didn't realize that the business was a work. Someone who, completely bought the concept of this is real and would fight you or argue vehemently with you, if you told them anything differently. And the business was trying to create marks. We wanted marks because the marks were going to show up and believe it and buy into the fantasy. But now I think marks are, because I think everyone's smart. So I think the problem now is because even little kids have social media, so they can see it. They can see the exposure of it. I think marks now are just people who are really caught up in it and can lose themselves in the fantasy of what they're seeing. So call me a mark, I am. Call me a smart mark, but I'm definitely a mark when I see good wrestling.
Absolutely, same here. The way I described it to her was when you go out to the ring, you look around and you look to see, I guess, who's the lowest hanging fruit or the someone you know you're going to get a reaction out of, and you focus on them and you try to get the reaction out of them because if they're so animated and they have that visceral reaction, everyone else around them is going to rally and they're going to react the same way.
Yes. And you have to remember the best wrestlers really think about this. And that was the outcome of my research too. Those who were the most introspective were the most successful. Now understand that was back in the 80s. I don't know what that research would look like now. But those who were the most introspective and thought the most about their characters and thought the most about their interactions and what made sense and what didn't. I got quite an education from Boris Malenko and from Bob Roop, and I was astounded. Being a person who's educated, I was astounded by how much thought they put into their character and their stories and when they should do something and when something meant something and it didn't. One of my favorite stories is I worked a match. I had the pleasure, the honor of working against Junkyard Dog. And I thought I had a great match with him until he took me to the side afterwards. And it was an inconsequential match, a cold match, but the crowd seemed to like it. But he pulled me aside and was gracious enough to talk to me for about 45 minutes and talk to me about psychology. And he loved the fact that I was a psychologist, but he pulled me aside and it was so helpful to listen to him. And I was astounded by how he thought out everything that happened and why it made sense and why you don't do this at this time and what the expectations are. And so the really good wrestlers spontaneously think on their feet about what makes sense and what doesn't, why they should or shouldn't do certain things, and how it best results in a crowd reaction. Those are the best people. And I'm proud to say my research backed that up way back in the day, that those people who think it through are the most successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I have a home promotion. It's really the only promotion I work for because I'm 40 and two bad knees and everything. But one of the things is backstage is I help out with, people knowing what to do with their character. They'll explain it to me and then they'll say, I want to do this. And I'll say that doesn't really make sense.
Mm.
We had guys who wanted to do like springboard stuff and I'm like, but why? And they couldn't
Right.
answer. And I say, if you can't answer the why, other than just saying it looks cool, then maybe you should rethink what you're doing. And
Right.
so it kind of that's where I come in, and a lot of people respect me for that, is because of that, and also the finish, because I'll explain to them, okay, you're first on the card. You don't want to have this type of finish because you're just going to ruin the whole show. And obviously, you don't want to ruin the show.
Right.
So you have to have it make sense. Make it make sense. That's what I always tell people if they come to me and they'll say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. And immediately I answer the question with a question is why? And so that's really for me a big part of wrestling psychology too, is explaining the why.
Yes, and having teaching young guys to have respect for the history of the business and for the veterans of that business who can talk to them about these things, about the psychology and why things make sense and why other things don't make sense and why your character just wouldn't do that. It doesn't make any sense for your character to do that. And those kinds of lessons are well taught. And if someone keeps that in mind and develops and grows from that, they can really be a big star in professional wrestling. They can really be someone who has an impact. You don't have to be the most athletic guy. You don't have to be the smartest guy. You just have to be a guy who thinks through what makes sense. And even if you lose every match, if you get over with a crowd and know what they respond to or react to because of how you look or how you act or what you say, you're going to make money in the professional wrestling world.
Yeah. And one of my matches, I was a referee, and the guy came out and he talked about how he didn't have an opponent, and he looked at me and he was like, "You're going to be my opponent tonight." Another referee came out, and at first the crowd was just like, "What is going on here?" But about like 5 minutes in, based on how I was selling, how I was reacting, I started getting a chant going when I started making my comeback. And it's like, it's something so simple as that. And you get this, I got goosebumps. Like, I was in the ring, I was in the corner, I was slapping the turnbuckle, and the crowd was chanting. And I was like, this is one of the greatest moments of my life, because I've
Yeah.
never felt that reaction.
It's truly, for a theatrical reference, it's truly roar the grease paint smell of the crowd. I mean, once it's intoxicating. And once you get that, it's so hard to walk away from it and to leave it and to not have that there. It's having so much power and control in your hands that with just one look, like Greg Valentine used to do, just one, like Buddy Rogers long time ago used to do, just a strut, just a walk, just a look at the right time can evoke such a strong reaction from a crowd that it's such a powerful feeling that people, when they leave it, they never forget that, how powerful that was.
Yep. And like you said about knowing when to do something, Buddy Rogers, he always had that timing down, like when to do that strut, when to have like that grimace on his face. It's just, those are the things. And I don't think they're really taught anymore. Again, I started doing wrestling school again a couple years ago, and a lot of it was fun, but a lot of it they focus on is just drills, just take a bump, back bump, do a regal roll, do all
Yeah.
sorts of things like that. And it's like you get conditioned to do that. So you get comfortable with being able to bump and hit the ropes. And they even teach like trying to go over the top turnbuckle, over the top rope. I was never able to do that. I'm not built like that. I'm 5'8", 260. Like, I'm not hitting but I can hit the ropes and do everything
Right.
else. But there's a lot of things, it's standardized, and, people of different body types and different, mindsets aren't going to be able to do the same thing over and over again.
Well, if you watch many of the social media, whether it's on Instagram or whether it's on TikTok, you can see many, many examples of everyone wants to be Mick Foley on steroids. Everyone risking their lives. There's some things that I jump out of my chair when I watch them. People setting themselves on fire and jumping off 20 feet platforms onto the floor. So when I see those kinds of things with guys that don't have the physical abilities and skills to pull off even half of that, someone's going to get hurt, and I'm sure they've been hurt very many times as a result. They're risking their lives for $25 and never going to get anywhere with it because they think that's what gets over. That's not what gets over. What gets over is building the story and building to that point and staying within the range, within the lane of what you can do. Do what you can do well, but don't try to do the other things and risk your life and the life of who you're working with. I want to make one other comment to you. You mentioned Buddy Rogers. Buddy Rogers is one of my favorite people to talk about. Everyone's got a different Mount Rushmore of wrestling. For me, Buddy Rogers would be one of my people on the Mount Rushmore. And the reason why is because he is a person who, when television started, he was one of the big stars. And at one time, I know I'm dating myself, but I talked to Lou Thez one time towards the end of his career, the great Lou Thez. And I said, Lou, I said, Buddy Rogers was so lucky to have television. I said, it really helped him make his career. And Lou looked at me with a straight face. I call him Mr. Thez. In those days, he said to me, he said, Red, he said, Buddy Rogers made television. And what he meant by that was Buddy Rogers packed an arena and gave people a reason to watch a black and white little screen. He said, if not for Buddy Rogers, who knows? It would have taken TV a lot longer to catch on, but he was a huge TV star before there was TV stars. That tells you how the importance and the cultural impact of what professional wrestling is and how it's affected people through decades and decades and generations, whether you talk about Hulkamania or what Stone Cold Steve Austin did or Buddy Rogers or Bruno Sammartino. Those all had cultural impacts, not just on us who are marks who like it, but on the whole outside culture as well. And people neglect to remember that.